Hi. I'm wanting to summarize part 3 of Man and His Symbols. Just completed reading it tonight. Part 3 is called The Process of Individuation, written by Marie-Louise von Franz. So, I have a few observations about it. I've written them down, so I won't be too rambly, and I can come to a rather quick conclusion. Plus, I want to read a little bit out of a few paragraphs out of the chapter, the final chapter. All right, so first of all, what I want to say, my notes on the final chapter of the process of individuation is being titled "The Social Aspect of the Self." It's this chapter of Man and His Symbols shows von Franz, the author, is very much depending upon the interface of the psyche to the exclusion of primacy of any spiritual angle. And that's all right. After having made that discovery for myself, I feel it adds much to the depth of the separation between psychology and the unconscious concepts from Jung and his immediate colleagues in analytical psychology, and the actual living experience and transformation of those in a religious worldview. But while one could argue, indeed, as von Franz describes many theologians arguing against Jung, it's still important to understand that the author, it's important to understand where she's coming from and that she is valid everywhere she writes, basically. That's my take on it. Okay, so this final chapter describes how people grow and transform themselves through individuation. Yeah. They become more connectable to others in a way that transcends personal hobby interests and work and neighborhood proximity and transient aspects like friends or connected with neighbors, connected with people in town because of children's sports teams or something. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of the pages. Yeah, let's see if I can get this right. Let's jump over to this. Nope. Here we are. But it also happens at times that dreams genuinely tell us something about other people. In this way, the unconscious plays a role that is far from being fully understood. Like all the higher forms of life, man is in tune with the living beings around him to a remarkable degree, and he perceives their sufferings and problems, their positive and negative attributes and values instinctively, quite independently of his conscious thoughts about other people. Our dream life allows us to have a look at these subliminal perceptions, and shows us that they have an effect on us. After having an agreeable dream about somebody, even without interpreting the dream, I shall involuntarily look at that person with more interest. The dream image may have deluded me because of my projections, or it may have given me objective information. To find out which is the correct interpretation requires an honest and attentive attitude and careful thought. But as is the case in all inner processes, it is ultimately the self that orders and regulates one's human relationships, so long as the conscious ego takes the trouble to detect the delusive projections and deals with these inside himself instead of outside. It is in this way that spiritually attuned and similarly oriented people find their way to one another, to create a group that cuts across all the usual social and organizational affiliations of people. Such a group is not in conflict with others. It is merely different and independent. The consciously realized process of individuation thus changes a person's relationships. The familiar bonds, such as kinship or common interests, are replaced by a different type of unity, a bond through the self. So, yeah. It's pretty good. It's an interesting take on the social self. I was presuming before I got to reading the actual chapter that it was going to be on more about like a collective unconscious, collective self, but it's more about just the self, the individual, the actual self within one person connecting with the individual self of basically, in a nutshell, one single other person. Anyway, von Franz attempts to present an argument for the development of the religious ideas out of the psyche. I believe this is reasonable, but it also demonstrates an exclusivity that there may be no spiritual material outside of the human psyche, which is something I consider limited. As she puts it, we can see how a ritual or religious custom can spring directly from an unconscious revelation experienced by a single individual. I'm just jumping in here. She gave a long example of I believe it was a native Sioux, the Ogallala Sioux medicine man named Black Elk. In his autobiography, it's quite a nice story. Now returning to what I was reading or quoting from her. Religious customs can spring directly from an unconscious revelation experienced by a single individual. During a long process of evolution, the original material is shaped and reshaped by words and actions, is beautified, and acquires increasingly definite forms. The crystallizing process, however, has a great disadvantage. More and more people have no personal knowledge of the original experience and can only believe what their elders and teachers tell them about it. They no longer know that such happenings are real, and they are, of course, ignorant of how one feels during the experience. In their present forms, such religious traditions often resist further creative alterations by the unconscious. Theologians sometimes even defend these true religious symbols and symbolic doctrines against the discovery of a religious function in the unconscious psyche, forgetting that the values that they fight for owe their existence to that very same function. Continuing, she writes, without a human psyche to receive divine inspirations and utter them in words or shape them in art, no religious symbol has ever come into the reality of our human life. We need only to think of the prophets and evangelists. If somebody objects that there is a religious reality in itself, independent of the human psyche, I can only answer such a person with this question. Who says this, if not a human psyche? Unquote. So, something I think is, yes, indeed, the human body is the receiving antenna, and the psyche stores and processes the divine inspirations. Apparently divine. There are multiple instances where phrases like still really believe religious contents and messages. And I was concerned, I was wondering if the word still is being used, suggesting an attitude of primitive versus modern judgment. And while that may be true, it is just as likely to be an acknowledgement that as time goes by, fewer people are choosing to maintain an awareness of the divine outside their very young years, perhaps. As people grow older, and as new generations are born and grow up over time. So there's a lot of wrap-up in this chapter to conclude a lot of the ideas in the previous chapters within part 3. And once again, it drives towards, like, the process of individuation is the title of the whole part. It drives towards a conclusion about the individuation process. So I'm going to read the last paragraph now, and the last paragraph. Intellectual chit-chat is thus replaced by meaningful events that occur in the reality of the psyche. Hence, for the individual to enter seriously into the process of individuation in the way that has been outlined means a completely new and different orientation to life. For scientists, it also means a new and different scientific approach to outer facts. How this will work out in the field of human knowledge and in the social life of human beings cannot be predicted. But to me it seems certain that Jung's discovery of the process of individuation is a fact that future generations will have to take into account if they want to avoid drifting into stagnant or even regressive outlook. Yeah. Thus ends and continues on to part 4 of Man and His Symbolisms in the Visual Arts. So in conclusion, I'm just going to quickly wrap up. To be being ultra honest with oneself internally, that's what it's all about. And entering into active imagination, as is described earlier in this part, seeking to document and track dreams material. I need to speak aloud the ideas or messages I receive from the unconscious or the Holy Spirit. Messages that come to my mind. It helps to, well, at least form a mental picture of them. I have been in dream states so many times and had the dream, came out of the dream and tried to recall what I had dreamed. And all I get is an empty vacuum of dark, or if it's like a dark cloud of nothing. But if I'm slowly coming out of the dream state, then I can try to compress and capture that information, which I've done recently, to great success. So if I speak aloud, well, say I speak them aloud after I've woken, I can sharpen my awareness and sensitivity for the messages coming from the self. But this is just my process, and this is how I interpreted this part 3, the process of individuation. And actually I was in a used bookstore today and I found another book by Carl Jung, which I am quite happy for. The Undiscovered Self has symbols and the interpretation of dreams, plus the actual titled The Undiscovered Self, which I believe comes from Collected Works 10. Anyway, I don't remember exactly which one it comes from, but I'm going to be reading that next. Hope you found this interesting. I'm just going through some books and reading them and finding that making these videos is quite enjoyable. If you'd like to keep up with other videos that I create, feel free to subscribe and click the notification button. It's a new feature on YouTube apparently. And yeah, I'm going to continue with the Tao Te Ching and analysis of some of the Proverbs in the Old Testament and some other source material. I'm going to get into a little bit of the writings of the of Buddhism, and yeah, so I'll be covering a lot more world classic history as I just work through it for myself. And really, I'm going to be really looking forward to this week. I should be receiving the full facsimile edition of Carl Jung's Red Book, which is a colossal sized coffee table book. Really looking forward to that, and I'll probably make another video. So thanks. Take care.